The North Atlantic, 1943. The night sea is black. Not dark, black, the kind of black that swallows sound, thought, and even God himself. Somewhere beneath those freezing waters, a German U-boat glides like a ghost, silent, patient, and unseen. Inside, the air is heavy with diesel and sweat. The men breathe slowly, each sound magnified by steel walls and fear. A single red light flickers over their faces, pale, tired, hollow-eyed. And at the center of it all, standing beneath the periscope, is a man who will soon make a decision that will defy his country, his orders, and perhaps even history itself. Captain Lieutenant Peter Erich Kremer, commander of U-333. A hunter of the deep. A name whispered across Allied convoys, the sea wolf of the Atlantic. Outside, the Atlantic roars. Convoys move through the darkness like wounded animals, merchant ships carrying oil, food, weapons, and men. Each light they shine is a beacon to death. Every wave could hide a torpedo, and the hunters are waiting. In the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was not a battle. It was a war within a war. Thousands of miles of open ocean. Hundreds of ships lost. Tens of thousands of men vanished without graves. For every U-boat captain, the rules were clear. Sink the enemy, show no mercy, leave no survivors. That was the creed written into steel and salt water. It was not personal, it was duty. But on one cold night, somewhere between the icy spray and the hum of the diesel engines, that creed would be broken. The torpedo struck without warning. A violent flash, a column of fire tearing through the night. On the surface, a merchant ship, SS Pennsylvania Sun, an American tanker, bursts into flames. Oil spills across the waves, igniting into a floating inferno. Men jump into the water, their screams cut short by the freezing cold. The ship tilts, groans, and begins to die. Below, in the dim red light of U-333, the men listen. The sonar pings fade into the rhythm of the ocean, the sound of their success. The war machine has done its job, and yet, Captain Kremer does not celebrate. He lifts his head from the periscope and stares into nothing. He has heard that sound before, not just the blast, but the voices that follow. Voices of men, distant, fading, begging the sea to let them live. He closes his eyes. Kremer was not like most of his peers. He had joined the Kriegsmarine before the war, when the sea was still a place of honor, not a graveyard. He believed in precision, in discipline, in the dignity of command. But war had changed everything. By 1943, U-boat losses were catastrophic. The hunters had become the hunted. Kremer himself had barely survived depth charge attacks that left his ears ringing for days. He had seen the faces of his crew, boys barely 20, aged by fear. He had watched them die quietly, without complaint, in the cold dark of the ocean floor. He knew what it meant to drown. He knew what it meant to suffocate while the world above went on living. And so, when his periscope broke the surface that night, and he saw the oil burning and the men clinging to lifeboats, he felt something no order had prepared him for. "Sir," his first officer said softly, "survivors in the water." Kremer didn't respond. He simply looked again. Through the scope, tiny shadows, men waving, signaling, hoping. He could have left them. Every rule told him to. A U-boat that lingered on the surface became prey. But instead, he did something unthinkable. He surfaced. Slowly. Quietly. The conning tower broke through the waves, black against black, as if the sea itself was exhaling. The sailors in the lifeboat froze, eyes wide, breath caught. They knew that silhouette. They knew what came next. But no gunfire came. No warning shot. No final strike. Just a voice, calm, steady, German, echoing across the waves. "Do not be afraid. We will send your position." And in that moment, the sea itself seemed to pause. In the middle of a war built on obedience and destruction, one man had chosen mercy. It was not strategy. It was not rebellion. It was something older. Something that existed before uniforms and orders. The sound of men calling for help, and a captain who could still hear them. The year was 1943, the turning tide of the Atlantic War. For nearly 4 years, the North Atlantic had been a graveyard. From the coast of Ireland to the edge of Newfoundland, ships burned nightly on the horizon, silent orange dots swallowed by black water. Merchant convoys carried the blood of the Allied war effort: food, fuel, ammunition. Without them, Britain would starve, the front lines would collapse, and Europe would remain under the swastika, and against them. Hunted the U-boats. They called themselves Wulfa des Meers, wolves of the sea, steel beasts built to stalk in packs, to strike unseen, to vanish beneath the waves before vengeance could come. At the height of their power, they ruled the ocean's underworld. Inside the Third Reich, Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the U-boat arm, had built a doctrine unlike any other. He did not believe in battleships or glory. He believed in strangulation. His plan was simple: cut the Atlantic artery, and the Allied body would die. Convoys would be overwhelmed by coordinated wolf-pack attacks, 15, 20, even 30 submarines striking at once. Each captain acted as both hunter and survivor, a lone mind in the vast silence of the deep. For men like Kapitänleutnant Peter Erich Kremer, this was the world they lived in. A war fought in shadows, where the enemy was not only ships, but depth, darkness, and time itself. Every mission began the same way. A quiet morning at Kiel, Saint-Nazaire, or Lorient. Crewmen standing in neat rows beside their U-boat, a narrow coffin of steel, wives and children waving from the pier, the smell of diesel already thick in the air. They would vanish into the Atlantic for weeks, sometimes months. Some never came back. By 1943, the hunters were dying faster than they could be replaced. Sonar had improved. Escort ships carried radar and aircraft patrols hunted from the skies. The Atlantic, once a place of domination, was now a trap. Yet the orders never changed. No rescue, no assistance, no delay. The enemy's destruction is absolute. Dönitz called it Befehl 154. It forbade helping survivors, even giving their position, because mercy slowed efficiency, because mercy was weakness. The ocean had no time for compassion. Kramer knew these rules well. He had seen captains court-martialed for breaking them. He had lost comrades for less. And yet, beneath the uniform and iron discipline, Peter Erich Kremer was not a machine. He was born in Dortmund in 1911, not to wealth, not to nobility, but to a modest German family. He joined the Navy as a teenager, drawn to the sea's discipline, to its order. To him, the sea was both pure and cruel, a place that judged men by skill, not ideology. When war came, he served loyally. He believed in Germany, not the Germany of conquest, but of duty and pride. But as the years passed and the sea turned red, that belief began to hollow. He had seen too many faces vanish, too many ships burn, too many orders obeyed without question. Life aboard a U-boat was claustrophobic, suffocating, and relentless. The steel tube held barely 50 men, packed shoulder to shoulder. Air was thick with oil fumes and stale sweat. Food spoiled. Water was rationed. Sleep came in fragments, 20 minutes here, an hour there, always with one ear listening for the ping of sonar. When they dived, the world closed in. Metal groaned. Rivets creaked. Every sound became the possible start of death. And through it all, Kremer remained calm, disciplined, composed, feared by his men but respected too. He was known for precision, for never wasting a shot, for never showing panic. He was also known for something rarer: restraint. He did not revel in destruction. He did not gloat over sinkings. He simply did his job and carried the weight of it in silence. But in 1943, silence was no longer enough. The Atlantic had changed. The Allies had cracked German codes. The wolf packs were being hunted, trapped, obliterated. That spring alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed, more than one every 2 days. In Berlin, the propaganda still spoke of glory. But in the deep, captains whispered another truth. We are the hunted now. Kremer knew it. Every patrol was a coin toss between life and the sea. And still, he went. Because for men like him, there was no turning back. By the time U-333 slipped into the Atlantic that summer, Kremer was no longer a believer in victory. He was a believer in survival. The orders were simple: patrol the North Atlantic, intercept convoys, sink anything bearing the Allied flag. No witnesses, no hesitation. And yet, deep down, something in him was shifting. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps the quiet guilt that came with every kill. Or perhaps, as he watched the ocean swallow ship after ship, he began to understand what few could say aloud: that even in war, the sea belongs to no one. In the distance, under the cover of mist, he would soon find his next target, an American tanker cutting through the fog, unaware that history was about to stop its heartbeat. But this time, when the torpedoes struck and the men cried out from the lifeboats, Kremer would not follow the book. He would follow something older, something human. The sea was a mirror that night, black, cold, endless. The moon hung low, a silver ghost floating above the Atlantic, and somewhere beneath that reflection, U-333 moved like a shadow. Inside, the air was thick and metallic. A constant hum of the engines filled the narrow steel corridors. Men whispered over gauges, hands steady but eyes hollow. They were young, most of them barely 20. And yet, they had already seen what no man should ever see. Ships burning from the inside out, bodies adrift in silence, faces that appeared in dreams and refused to fade. Captain Lieutenant Peter Erich Kremer sat in the command chair, back straight, eyes fixed on the depth gauge. To his crew, he was Ali, short for alligator, the nickname he'd earned years before for his calm reptilian patience. He never shouted, never panicked. He carried himself with an eerie stillness, the kind of calm that only those who've looked death in the eye can master. But inside, that calm was cracking. For weeks, he had been at sea, hunting convoys that never came, dodging aircraft that always seemed to know where he was. The Allied sonar had become merciless. The Atlantic, once a vast hunting ground, now felt like a cage. He knew the statistics. They all did. By mid-1943, the life expectancy of a U-boat crew was 6 patrols. Kremer was on his 9th. That night, the sonar operator, a boy from Hamburg named Lenz, stiffened. A faint echo pulsed through the headphones. "One contact," he whispered. "Bearing 270, slow-moving, could be single merchant." Kremer leaned over the plotting table. A solitary ship, moving alone, no escort, no aircraft nearby. Perfect prey. He gave the order quietly. "Surface at dusk. Prepare tubes 1 and 2. The men obeyed without hesitation. But as the sub rose toward the surface, Kremer felt the familiar sickness rising in his chest. He told himself it was just the motion, the stale air, the pressure. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. When they breached the surface, the wind hit like a blade. Salt spray, diesel fumes, the faint gleam of moonlight on metal. Through his binoculars, Kremer saw it. A tanker, broad and slow, silhouetted against the horizon. An American flag rippled faintly at its stern. He could almost hear the faint rhythm of its engines, beating like a heart in the dark. He could almost imagine the men aboard, smoking, laughing, maybe thinking they were safe for one more night. He raised his hand. Tubes 1 and 2 fire. A hiss, a rush. 2 white trails cut through the sea. Seconds stretched like minutes. Then impact. A distant roar rolled across the water. Flames leapt skyward, orange and blue, reflecting off the waves. The tanker split in 2. The crew of U-333 erupted in cheers, shouts of "Treffer!" Direct hit. Fists pounding metal, but Kremer didn't move. Through his binoculars, he watched the men in the water, black silhouettes against burning oil. He saw one clinging to debris, another dragging a wounded comrade through the slick. He heard faintly their cries carried by the wind, and he felt nothing, or perhaps too much. The rule was clear. No rescue, no hesitation. Leave no witnesses. He'd followed that order dozens of times before, but this time, something inside him shifted. "Lower speed," he ordered. His first officer stared at him. "Herr Kapitän?" Kremer didn't repeat himself. The engines slowed. The submarine drifted closer to the wreckage. Through the periscope, the scene was chaos. Fire on water, men shouting for help. One man waved frantically, his face streaked with oil and terror. He couldn't have been older than 25. Kremer turned away. He couldn't watch anymore, but his crew watched, and they understood what was happening, even before he spoke. "Bring 2 of them aboard," he said quietly. "The rest, we cannot save." No one moved for a moment. It was an order that defied everything they'd been taught, everything the Reich demanded, but they obeyed. They pulled 2 survivors from the burning sea. Both were barely conscious, one with burns down his arms, the other coughing up black water. They were Americans, enemies, and yet, in that moment, they were simply men trying not to die. Kremer ordered the medic to treat them. He gave them water, wrapped them in blankets, and stared at their faces. Faces so young they reminded him of his own crew. He didn't say it aloud, but everyone on board knew what this meant. They had broken Dönitz's law. If Berlin ever learned, U-333 would be erased, its captain tried, its crew imprisoned. But Kremer didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt human again. As dawn rose, he stood on the conning tower, the Atlantic glowing gold around him. The flames on the horizon had died. The sea was quiet again, and in that silence, Peter Erich Kremer realized something terrible. He had begun this war as a hunter, but somewhere between duty and mercy, he had become something else, something the Reich would never forgive. The Atlantic did not forgive. It remembered. By the time U-333 slipped back beneath the waves, the horizon behind them was a grave, a slick of oil and flame drifting into the dawn. 2 American sailors lay in the infirmary, barely breathing. The crew moved in silence. They knew what they had done, and they knew what it meant. In the tight corridors of the submarine, whispers spread like oil on water. Some men called it mercy. Others called it madness. The first officer, Lieutenant Vogel, confronted Kremer quietly, late that night, while the engines hummed like a heartbeat behind them. He was a career officer, stern, precise, the kind of man who lived by the book. Kremer had trusted him for years. "Sir," Vogel said, keeping his voice low, "we've taken prisoners. You know the order." Kremer didn't answer. He stood over the map table, tracing the route home, every red mark a patrol, every black dot a wreck. Vogel pressed on. "If we're found with Americans aboard, we'll be court-martialed. Dönitz will Kremer cut him off. I know what Dönitz will do." His voice was calm, but his eyes, sharp and gray, burned with something deeper. "And what would you have me do, Vogel? Leave them? Let the sea finish the job?" The first officer hesitated. "It's not our decision." Kremer turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "It was my torpedo that sank them. That makes it my decision." Silence. Only the steady thrum of the engines. Vogel looked away. "You're putting us all at risk." Kremer nodded. "Yes, I am." For the next 48 hours, the boat ran silent. They stayed deep, below 200 meters, where no aircraft could see them, and where the weight of the ocean pressed against the hull like a fist. Inside, time lost meaning. Air grew thin. Sweat dripped from the walls. The men slept in turns, their dreams haunted by the sound of screams echoing from the sea. The Americans, the survivors, drifted in and out of consciousness. One of them, the younger of the 2, woke on the 3rd day. His name was James Halloway, a gunner's mate from Ohio. He couldn't move his left arm, burned to the bone. He blinked in confusion, staring at the cramped steel walls. When he saw the German uniforms, panic flickered in his eyes. Kremer knelt beside him, speaking softly. "You're safe. You're aboard a U-boat. You were rescued." The words meant nothing to Holloway. He barely understood them, but the tone did. For a moment, the war seemed to fade. Two men on opposite sides of the same madness, breathing the same thin air. Later, Vogel found Kremer sitting alone in the radio room. The captain had torn a message from the machine, an encrypted transmission from Berlin. It read, U-333, report position. Wolfpack Order Bravo. Sink all survivors from Convoy HX-237, no exceptions. Kremer stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and slid it into his pocket. "We will not join the pack," he said. Vogel blinked. "Sir?" "We're heading home." The officer's voice cracked with disbelief. "That's desertion." Kremer looked at him steadily. "No, it's survival." The crew was restless. Some whispered that the captain had lost his nerve. Others said he had gone soft, that the Americans had cursed the ship. But there were a few quiet men with hollow eyes who understood. They had seen enough killing to know that mercy was its own kind of rebellion. Still, fear gnawed at them. They all knew what would happen if they were intercepted or searched. 2 enemy survivors aboard a German submarine, undeniable proof of treason. 3 nights later, as U-333 crossed through a storm front south of Iceland, the sea turned violent. Waves smashed against the hull. Lightning flashed across the control room like white fire. The younger American, delirious with fever, began shouting in English, loud enough to echo through the ship. For a moment, the entire crew froze. "Silence him!" Vogel shouted. Kremer stepped in, grabbing the man's arm, not with anger, but with desperation. The gunner's mate was crying, whispering something over and over. "Don't let me drown. Please don't let me drown." Kremer felt the words like a knife. When he looked up, every man in the room was watching him, waiting for an order. Waiting to know whether their captain was still one of them or something else entirely. He spoke quietly. "Get him below. Treat the fever." And that was it. No further explanation, no justification. After that night, no one questioned him again. Even Vogel obeyed in silence. The storm raged for another day, then broke into calm, and when dawn came, the ocean stretched out pure and blue, as if nothing had happened. Kremer stood alone on the conning tower, the cold wind cutting across his face. Behind him, 50 men slept in exhaustion, and 2 enemies breathed beside them, alive. He thought of Dönitz, of the Reich, of the invisible hand that demanded obedience even from the dead. He thought of the ocean, vast, indifferent, eternal. And for the first time, he realized the war would end one day, but the sea would not. And it would remember the choices made upon it. The sea had gone quiet again. Too quiet. For days, U-333 glided through the gray Atlantic like a wounded animal. The engines murmured softly. The propellers whispered. No songs, no laughter. Just the pulse of fear beating through the hull. Kremer had altered course, south by southwest, slipping away from the wolf packs, alone. Every mile brought them closer to France, and closer to discovery. Because now, the sea was no longer empty. It was listening. On the 6th day, the sonar operator raised his head, headphones pressed tight. A faint sound echoed through the water, rhythmic, distant, growing. "Propellers," he whispered. Not one, many. The convoy hunters, British destroyers, sweeping the mid-Atlantic gap were closing in. Kremer didn't hesitate. Periscope depth. Silent running. The men moved with practiced precision. Every motion slow, deliberate. Hands hovered over valves. Engines dimmed to a whisper. The whole submarine seemed to hold its breath. The depth gauge crept down 20, 40, 60 meters. The light shifted to red. The air grew heavy, Above them the sound deepened, the low thunder of propellers slicing the sea. Vogel glanced at Kremer, his face pale. "They've got radar, sir. They'll find us." Kremer's voice was steady. "They can find us, but they won't hear us." He leaned closer to the sonar man. "Report when they drop speed." The seconds stretched into minutes. Then the first ping. A high metallic note rang through the hull, clean and sharp. Once. Twice. Then came the explosion. A distant rumble, then a crushing roar as the first depth charge detonated above them. The submarine shook. Lights flickered. Dust fell from the ceiling. Men clung to the pipes and gauges, jaws tight, eyes wide. The radio crackled, interference from the blast. Kremer ordered it cut. Silence again, just the sound of water and breath. The British destroyers made their dance, circling, listening, attacking. Every few minutes another wave of charges fell. The sea became a cage of thunder. Metal screamed under pressure. Bolts snapped. A pipe burst, spraying hot steam across the control room. Still, no one moved without command. They had learned to fight fear the way they fought the sea, quietly. Kremer stood at the periscope, head tilted slightly, listening not to the explosions, but to the rhythm between them. Every captain knew it, the pattern of death. The drop, the roll, the pause, and between those beats, the chance to move. Hard to port. 1/4 speed. Hold course 172. The U-boat slid away, sinking deeper. 3 meters. Then 150. The hull groaned like an animal in pain. Vogel whispered, "She can't take more, sir." Kremer didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the depth gauge. 60, 170. The sound of the ocean pressed in on them, a living weight, and then silence. The charges stopped. The sonar pings faded, only the sound of water against steel. They waited. 1 minute. 5. 10. No more explosions. No more engines above. The destroyers were gone. A sigh escaped the crew. Not a cheer, just exhaustion. Hours later, when they surfaced under a pale sky, the Atlantic was calm again. Only oil slicks and drifting crates marked where others had died. Kremer climbed to the bridge. The air hit him like a blessing, cold, wet, real. He looked out toward the horizon west, where the Americans came from. Below deck, the 2 rescued sailors were barely alive. The ship's medic reported their conditions worsening. They had no proper medical supplies left. Vogel approached, his face shadowed. "If they die aboard, sir, the evidence dies with them." Kremer turned slowly. "And what do you suggest?" Vogel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Kremer's jaw tightened. "No, not this way. Not after all this." He went to the radio room, alone. The sea hissed softly against the hull outside, like breathing. He keyed in the long-range frequency, knowing what it meant. If the message was intercepted, it could expose them. But the choice was already made. He began to type. "To Allied Command. Survivors adrift. Position 50 Suitor north, 25 west. Immediate rescue required." He hesitated, then added one more line. "From vessel at sea. Neutral intent." He did not sign his name. He sent it once. No confirmation. No repeat. Then shut the radio down. That night, the ocean was silent again. The crew didn't know what their captain had done. Only Vogel, who'd seen the faint glow of the transmitter light, guessed. But he said nothing. Because by then, even he had begun to understand that there are moments in war when orders are no longer enough, when obedience becomes cowardice, and defiance becomes humanity. As dawn broke, a faint pink light touched the water. The Americans slept quietly, still breathing. The men of U-333 watched the sunrise in silence, tired, hollow, but alive. No medals, no cheers, just the whisper of the waves against the hull. Kremer stood at the edge of the conning tower, eyes fixed on the east. France was still far ahead. He knew that what he had done would follow him, through interrogations, through whispers, through history. But for now, the sea was calm, and for a brief moment, so was his conscience. The morning mist lay low over the Bay of Biscay, A pale gray veil stretched across the water. For the men of U-333, it looked almost peaceful. But beneath that still surface, death was circling. The Atlantic War had entered its final desperate chapter. Allied aircraft now patrolled the skies with radar that could pierce even the fog. The hunters of the deep were no longer invisible. They were prey. Kremer knew it. He had studied the new Allied tactics, the long-range bombers, the sonar buoys, the destroyers that no longer slept. Every mile toward the French coast was a gamble, a wager between steel and sky. And yet, that morning, as U-333 surfaced to charge batteries, he allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The sea was calm. The air smelled faintly of oil and salt. The engines hummed softly beneath his boots. He could hear gulls, the first sign of land in weeks. They were close. So close. In the control room, the atmosphere had lightened. Men shaved for the first time in days. Someone brewed coffee, weak, bitter, but enough to taste like home. Even Vogel managed a faint smile. "We'll see the coast by evening," he said. Kremer nodded but didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the periscope lens, as if the horizon itself held a warning. He had lived long enough with the sea to know peace was often the camouflage of death. At 0912 hours, the radar operator froze. A faint signal blinked on the screen. Then another. 2 contacts. Altitude descending. Fast. Aircraft inbound. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Kremer didn't hesitate. Crash, dive. Schnell. Klaxons blared. Men scrambled. The U-boat groaned as ballast tanks flooded, and the deck tilted steeply downward. Above them, the mist split open. 2 British Sunderland flying boats dove out of the clouds, engines roaring, wings glinting in the gray light. From their bellies fell the hunters' weapons, depth charges, perfectly spaced. The ocean convulsed. A wall of sound and pressure smashed through the hull. Lights burst. Metal screamed. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Instruments shattered. The U-boat plunged deeper, creaking under the crushing weight. Vogel shouted, "We've lost trim control." The bow dipped 30 degrees, then 40. Water sprayed from the ruptured seals. The depth gauge spun 80 meters, 100, 120. Kremer gripped the periscope housing, voice steady in the chaos. "Blow main ballast. Level her out." A hiss. A roar. The submarine lurched upward, but another explosion followed, closer, sharper. The lights died completely. Now there was only red emergency glow and the sound of men breathing too fast. In the half-dark, Kremer moved by touch. His voice was calm, the way a surgeon speaks during crisis. "All compartments report. Damage control, forward." One by one the replies came. Flooding, midship. Fire in the battery room, 1 man missing. The boat was bleeding. Kremer made a choice that few captains dared to make under attack. He surfaced. The logic was brutal, but clear if they stayed below. The next run would crush them. On the surface, at least, they could fight. "Prepare flak gun," he ordered. "Arm deck crew." The U-boat broke through the water, bursting into the gray light. Spray and smoke rose together. Above, the Sunderlands were already turning for another pass. Kremer climbed to the bridge. His face was pale, streaked with salt. The gunners took their positions, young men with shaking hands and frost-bitten fingers. The air filled with the staccato of 20mm cannon fire. Tracer rounds arced into the sky, red against gray. For a moment, one of the British planes wavered, smoke trailing from its wing. It banked hard, losing altitude. The men below shouted, not in triumph, but in disbelief. Then came the next burst of bombs. The ocean erupted again. The shockwave tore through the deck. Metal flew. Men screamed. Vogel was thrown against the railing, blood in his mouth. Kremer was slammed to his knees, then dragged himself upright. "Get below!" someone shouted. But Kremer didn't move. He stood on the bridge, staring at the sky, at the descending aircraft, now so close he could see the pilot's face. For a brief instant, their eyes met hunter and hunted, mirror images of the same fate. Then the bombs fell. The sea swallowed U-333. For several minutes, there was nothing but oil, foam, and drifting debris. The Sunderlands circled once, then turned away. Another U-boat gone, they thought. Another name erased beneath the waves. But they were wrong. Minutes later, a dark shape rose from the wreckage. Bent, scarred, but alive. The men of U-333 had survived barely. 2 dead, 6 wounded. The rest, silent, staring into the water that had almost claimed them. Kremer, his face cut and uniform torn, gave a single order. Set course for Lorient. No signals, no surface. He descended the ladder slowly, gripping the rails with trembling hands. For the first time, his composure cracked. He sat in his cabin, the door closed, the dim light flickering across his face. On the desk lay his war log, its pages stained with oil and blood. He opened it, stared for a long time, then wrote only one line. We surfaced for life, and found death waiting. 3 days later, U-333 limped into the port of Lorient. The dockworkers stared. The hull looked as if it had been chewed by the sea itself. The men disembarked in silence. No parade, no fanfare. Kremer saluted the harbor officer, then walked alone down the quay, boots echoing against the concrete. He had returned, but something of him was still out there, drifting on the gray Atlantic, where he had chosen mercy over murder, and nearly paid the price. Lorient. Summer, 1943. The harbor smelled of oil, rust, and defeat. What had once been a proud U-boat base now looked like the skeleton of a dying beast. Bomb craters pocked the shoreline. The pens, massive concrete caverns built to protect Germany's wolves of the sea, were scarred and trembling under daily Allied bombardment. When U-333 limped back into port, there was no applause. No flags, just the sound of cranes and distant sirens. The men who stepped ashore were ghosts of themselves, salt-encrusted faces, hollow eyes. They had sailed into the heart of the Atlantic and returned with something more than wounds. They carried silence. Kapitän Leutnant Peter Erich Kremer submitted his report the next morning. It was brief, meticulous, and coldly professional, just as the Navy expected. He wrote of tonnage sunk, of depth charge attacks survived, of damage to the hull and crew. He did not write of the lifeboat. He did not write of the men he had chosen to save. He did not mention the radio message that might have reached Allied ears. That line of mercy was erased before the ink even dried. For a few weeks, Kremer remained in Lorient, overseeing repairs. He walked among the wreckage of the pens, hearing the echo of explosions every night. Young sailors saluted him in the corridors. They called him Seawolf, the Sea Wolf. They spoke of his survival with awe. But when he met their eyes, he saw something else reflected back. The same blind faith he had once held. The faith that war was honor, and duty was virtue. Now, it felt hollow. In September, Kremer was summoned to Kiel, a quiet transfer order. No explanation. He knew what it meant. The High Command had questions. Inside a gray room that smelled of tobacco and damp uniforms, 2 officers waited. One from BDU headquarters, the U-boat command. Another from the Gestapo. They questioned him about his patrol, the damaged log entries, the intercepted Allied transmission reporting survivors at sea. The British claimed the message came from an unknown vessel, German in origin. Kremer's answers were measured. He blamed atmospheric interference, said nothing of his decision. The younger officer smirked. "We are fighting a war, Kapitän Leutnant, not running a charity." The older one simply stared at him and said quietly, "Next time, remember which side you are on." The interview ended. No charges, no commendations, just a warning that hung heavier than any reprimand. Outside, the rain fell over Kiel's naval base. Kremer stood for a long time, watching the gray waters of the Baltic roll against the docks. He thought of the lifeboat again, those faces in the dark, shivering but alive. He wondered if the message had reached them, if rescue had come. He would never know. As the war dragged on, U-boat command continued its losing battle. By 1944, the Atlantic had become a graveyard. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, over 30,000 never came home. Kremer survived, but barely. He commanded again, fought again, and finally, when Germany fell, he was captured by the British. In the prisoner camps, he spoke little. He spent most of his time writing in a small notebook, a captain's diary, not for the Navy, but for himself. One guard later recalled seeing him sitting alone by the wire fence, watching the sunset over the English countryside. When asked what he was thinking, Kremer replied softly, "I'm listening for the sea." After the war, he returned to a nation in ruins. Germany's cities were rubble, its fleet gone. The men who had once been feared as wolves of the deep were now ghosts walking among the living. Kremer found work in civilian shipping for a time. He wrote no memoirs, sought no publicity. He attended reunions rarely, and when he did, he said little. But among those who served under him, stories began to circulate. Stories of the night he surfaced beside a burning ship, of the message sent in defiance of orders, of the captain who refused to let the ocean have the last word. There were no official records to prove it, no medals to mark it, only the memories of a few men who had seen what mercy looked like in the middle of war. Years later, when he finally published his wartime recollections, Kremer left that night out again. But between the lines, something lived, a quiet remorse, a whisper beneath the official narrative. He wrote, "It is easy to kill in war. It is harder to remember that your enemy bleeds the same color." When asked, near the end of his life, whether he still believed in the cause he had once served, he answered simply, "I believed in duty. Then I learned duty without conscience is only obedience. The sea taught me that." And for a moment, the silence that followed said everything. In 1992, Peter Erich Kremer died quietly at home in Hamburg. No ceremonies, no fanfare, just the sound of rain against the window. Somewhere in the Atlantic, the waves kept rolling, over the wrecks of ships, the bones of men, and the place where one German captain once surfaced to show the world that mercy could exist, even in war. The Atlantic has a long memory. It does not forget. Every tide that rolls over the wrecks of war whispers the names of the men who vanished beneath it. But sometimes it carries something else, not a name, not a wreck, but a question. And that question is this: what does it mean to remain human in a time built to destroy humanity? In the decades after the war, the world tried to make sense of what it had done to itself. Historians wrote volumes, politicians built monuments, and sailors, those who survived, drank to the ghosts who didn't. Some remembered the heroes, some remembered the monsters. Few remembered the men who stood somewhere between, those who disobeyed not out of rebellion, but out of conscience. Peter Erich Kremer became one of those shadows. His name appeared in a few footnotes, a few naval registers. To most, he was just another U-boat captain, efficient, professional, unremarkable. But beneath the silence of official history, the sea remembered. In 1978, a British naval historian researching U-boat operations stumbled upon a peculiar Allied signal log. It recorded a distress message intercepted on a night in 1942. Survivors cited, "Unknown vessel offering aid, possibly German. Message cut short." The historian, puzzled, cross-referenced it with U-boat patrol dates. Only one vessel had been near that position, U-333. The record ended there. He wrote to Kremer, who was then an aging man living quietly in Hamburg. His letter was polite, even reverent, ending with a question. "Did you send that signal?" Kremer's reply came a month later, a single page, written in blue ink, folded carefully in half. There are moments in war when one stops asking what is permitted and begins asking what is right. That night, I asked. No signature. The historian never published the letter. He kept it in his desk until his death, where it was later found among a bundle of notes labeled Acts of Grace at Sea. In the years that followed, U-333's story slowly resurfaced in lectures, in interviews, in the recollections of old sailors whose memories were no longer bound by fear or loyalty. A few of the British survivors, now gray-haired and stooped, spoke of that night. They remembered seeing the U-boat surface, the black shape against the fire, and hearing the strange metallic voice over the loudspeaker. They had thought it a trick at first, then a miracle. One of them, a radio officer named Hargreaves, said in a 1985 interview, "We thought we were done for. Then the German came up out of nowhere. He could have killed us. He didn't. I never knew his name, but I think about him every time I look at the sea. There are no medals for mercy, no parades for restraint. War writes its heroes in tonnage sunk, not lives spared. But sometimes, a single act, quiet, defiant, almost forgotten, ripples outward across generations." Kremer's choice did not end the war. It did not change its outcome. But in the middle of that vast ocean of cruelty, it proved that even there, especially there, humanity could still surface. And that is something no victory can erase. If you visit Lorient today, the old submarine pens still stand, immense concrete bunkers streaked with moss and time. They are museums now, their halls echoing with school children's laughter and the dripping of rain through cracked ceilings. In one of the exhibits, a small plaque bears Kremer's photograph. Below it, a single line reads, "He fought beneath the sea and found something deeper." Most visitors pass it by without notice, but every so often, someone stops. They look at the worn black and white face of the man in the U-boat cap, eyes calm, not proud, not defiant, and they wonder what story hides behind that silence. If they listen closely, they might almost hear it. The hum of engines underwater, the whisper of a voice in the dark. This is U-333, survivors sighted, sending position. Then static, then silence. The ocean does not care for sides or flags. It remembers only the weight of choices. Kremer's legacy lives not in medals, but in the idea that even in the darkest theater of war, compassion is not weakness. It is resistance. He once said to a friend, near the end of his life, "They called us wolves, but wolves do not kill when they are not hungry." Maybe that was his confession, or maybe it was his peace. When the tide rolls in along the French coast, over the wrecks of destroyers and submarines, it brings with it a soft, endless rhythm like breathing. Somewhere beneath those waves lies the truth of men like Kremer, those who, for a heartbeat, remembered what it meant to be human. And that memory, carried by the sea, is his truest monument.